So we're going to continue as Brother Donnie said, we're going to continue, and as on the screens behind me, is we're going to continue looking at the book of Mark. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment, how many of us like to win? Victory, right? Okay? In fact, the Indianapolis Indians field is named what? Victory Field, right? Okay? So everybody likes to win, and that's great. I mean, that's great. And also, too, Jesus gives us victory. Am I right? He does. He gives us victory. So and when you're reading in the New Testament, since that is where Jesus is found, especially the four Gospels, what you will find is a lot of things that he did. You're going to find him healing people, walking on water, feeding people, telling Peter, I love this one, telling Peter, throw the net over the other side of the boat, you'll get some fish, and he did all of those things. And there's a lot of different encounters you will find in the New Testament of Jesus healing people, and watching over people. And tonight we're going to pick up in a story of an event that took place starting in verse 21 of Mark chapter 5, okay? And it's going to be one that you have seen, you've heard this before. And it is, before we get to that, I just want to remind us that Jesus crossed back over the sea, okay? Remember, he had gone over the other side. He had cast out the demons. The swine had drowned, and he had now come back across the sea. Because if you remember, the people told him what? Leave, right? Okay, so he had to leave. All right, so he left. He did as they asked him to do so. And so now we are picking this up in verse 21 of Mark chapter 5. And he says this, we're going down to verse 34, okay? It says, when Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him. So he stayed by the seashore. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up, and on seeing him, fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her, so that she may get well and live. And he went off with him, and a large crowd was following him and pressing on him. A woman who had a hemorrhage for 20 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians, and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. After hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. For she thought, if I just touch his garments, I'll get well. Immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. And it says, immediately Jesus perceived in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, who touched my garments? I have to tell you what, I don't know about all of you, but the disciples, they are so human. Did you know that? I mean, they are. I mean, and there's times, you look at Peter, and Peter's like, I'll walk on that water. Well, Jesus said, come on. All right? And there's times they said, Jesus, there's not enough food to feed all these people. Send them home. Right? And here we have another one of these cases where the disciples are like, there's a whole bunch of people around you, and somebody touched you, and you're like, who touched me? Right? Literally, that's what they said. So it's interesting here, and interesting what's taking place here. So in these verses, we're seeing disease. We're seeing a young woman, a young child who is very, very sick to the point of death. We see a woman here who has a hemorrhage, who has been bleeding out in almost entire life, and the adult life, and she has sold and gotten no help from the doctors. So that, by the way, guys, though, that just proves that it still takes place today, right? Sometimes we go to the doctor and they can't help us. That doesn't mean they don't know what to do, but sometimes it takes God to fix us, am I right? In fact, it takes God always to fix us. So listen to what happens here. I want you to see something. Now, I want you to imagine that you had heard Jesus went across the sea. And you had heard that he was over there, and you had heard that the pigs literally had been, the demons had gone into the pigs, they had drowned, and now he has come back. And you're Jairus. And you're like, oh, Jesus is coming back. And obviously, a lot of other people were excited that Jesus was coming back. Because we noticed, if you notice, it said there's a large crowd. So now you're thinking, I got to go talk to him. Right? I've got to go talk to him. I need, my daughter needs healing. My daughter needs to be taken care of. So now we see him, and he's coming across, and he has been there, and there are so many people that are so excited to see him. And the first one we see here is a synagogue official. I'd say what I always love the whole idea of these synagogue officials, right? These pious, for the most part, these pious people. And they don't need help from anybody, right? Except for this guy didn't he? Because he understood what? Who Jesus was, what Jesus could do. He knew if he could get to Jesus, that Jesus, with his compassion, with his grace, with his mercy, that if he went to him, he knew he was the only one capable of making sure his daughter lived. So that's what he was going to go do. And that's exactly what he ended up doing here. He went to go and see this. Now, we know that this young lady is dying. We know, we don't have any idea really who this woman is. We don't know her name. We don't know anything about her. But what we do know is that she's second in line, at least as far as she might be concerned. Who was first? Jairus' daughter, right? Because that's where Jesus was heading. And Jairus, they were heading to find back to his home. They were heading back to see his daughter. And it tells us there that, in fact, in verse 23, that word there, implored, I always like the words, thinking through that, going, he was begging. He was so desperate for his daughter to live that he was willing. Listen, he was a synagogue ruler. I want you to think about that for a moment. He was a synagogue ruler. It took so much. He had to take a deep swallow. Okay? Swallow his what? Pride. He knew he had to go out there before these people. He knew Jesus could help him. He wouldn't have went. He would not have went if he didn't think Jesus was capable and or that he would do so. Okay? So we know that he's going out here, and at this point, listen, how many of us would help our children no matter what anybody thought about it, right? So, I mean, this should not surprise anybody. I mean, he's going to do this, okay? He's going to do this because Jesus is the only one that is going to help him. So as we look at this, we see two different people who are extremely in need. We saw Jairus. He personally wasn't, but his daughter was, which made him personally involved. And then we see this woman here who most certainly is at the end of her rope. She cannot go any further in her life. So we're seeing two different people with two different needs, but yet both of them show that both reactions that Jesus Christ gives them is about his love and his mercy. Okay? The love and his mercy that he has here. So we do know that we see this taking place. Now let's dig a little bit deeper into this young girl. If you go down to verse 42, remember I told you that you have two individuals getting help, but you have two completely different individuals with going in different directions. You have here in verse 42, it says, immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. So Jairus has had a daughter that has given him complete happiness for 12 years. He's excited about who his daughter is. He loves his daughter and he wants her to stick around. Okay? So that's what we have with Jairus. We have a 12-year-old daughter, his 12-year-old daughter that is there. And now we have a woman who is so sick of what is taking place. She spent all the money that she had. In fact, if you go to verse 25, okay? Verse 25 tells us that the woman has had this hemorrhage, this bleeding for 12 years. All right? So we have two people who are the same. We have a woman who has had this problem for the whole life of Jairus' daughter. Okay? We have this taking place. We have, again, two different people. We have Jairus, who would have been wealthy. Okay? This woman, she had some wealth because she was able to give it to the doctors. And again, the doctors were not able to help her. So she went to Jesus. We have a man who was very much capable of buying any doctor that he wanted to go see, but yet he didn't. His daughter still was sick and dying. So wealth doesn't help here in this case. It doesn't help at all that he doesn't get anything that they need. But look at verse 22. It says here, verse 22, that one of the synagogue officials, it says he came up, and on seeing him, he fell at his feet. That's complete humility. He knew who Jesus was. And he was so desperate, he didn't care. He didn't care what they thought about it. He needed to go to the only one who could take care of his daughter. And that's what he did. Then if you go down to verse 33, what we see here is this. But the woman, fearing and trembling all of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Here's two individuals. They came and they fell at the feet of Jesus. Here we see this taking place. It's interesting here because this whole thing of these individuals, they had, at least for the woman, she spent everything that she had. You ever go to the doctor and you go, I sure hope the doctors can't fix me? You don't? No, of course we don't. We go to the doctors thinking, I can't wait to get an answer for why I feel like I do, right? And hopefully they can help with why I feel the way that I do. So here's this woman. She went to the doctors. I am sure that she went with expectations, okay, that she could get better. And the doctors, I don't know, did they rip her off? Maybe. I don't know. But what we do know for certain is she's broke. What we know for certain is they couldn't help her. That we know for certain. And now we see this whole thing coming together. And now all that Jairus cared about was that his daughter would live. All this woman cared about is that this hemorrhage, this bleeding would go away. That's all she cared about. That was it. And they would do anything to make this take place. Now, what's interesting here, though, is that this woman here is now poverty-stricken because, remember, she said all of her money has been spent. And not only that, since she has this issue of blood, I believe that's another way that it is put in other versions, that she has this issue of blood, it made her unclean. And under the Old Testament laws that they were still living under, because Christ has not yet been crucified and resurrected from the dead, she was now unclean and she couldn't be around people. And if she was around people, she would make them unclean. Okay? But here she was in the crowd anyway. Did you think she cared about making other people unclean at this point? Not at this point. And maybe we don't know if she ever did, to be honest with you. We don't have any idea. All we know is that she tried to get herself fixed and healed more than once. So now she is there, this disease, again, whatever it is that is causing her to be sick. So she would not only carry a physical burden, she also would have a social problem, a social burden of people not wanting to have anything to do with her. So now she, again, remember I told you she's second in line. Remember who got a hold of Jesus first? Jairus. Okay, so she's second, as far as she was concerned, she's second in line. That's how she looked at it. And so here she is there. Now, I want us to see something here. Have you ever met people that just give up too easily? Okay? I want you to know that being stubborn is okay as long as we use it. I say we because I'm included in that group. We use it for right reasons. Okay? I will look at this woman here that we see as a stubborn woman. In a good way, ladies, okay? So don't let it hit me, all right? She was willing to do whatever it took to get better, okay? Whatever it took to get better. And so here we see that she was going to let nothing stand in her way. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And if you notice here, look what happens. It says to us that, if we go back down to verse 25, it says there that a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians, and spent all that she had and was now not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. After she hearing about Jesus, she came up into the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. Now remember, if we go back up to the very beginning of this, what we do know is in verse 21 that a large crowd gathered around him. Okay? Have you guys ever gone to some sort of an event, a concert, a play, something at the fairground, whatever it might be, and it's general admission, right? General admission. What's that mean? It means wherever you can sit, right? Okay? And if you want to find a spot, what do you generally do? Do you cower back and let everybody else go take your spot? Or do you try to, what'd you say, Don? You got to get there early, right? You try your best to get there early. And if you don't get there early, you try your best to get where you want to be, right? Okay, so I look at this woman. Remember, it said a large crowd had gathered. A large crowd was around Jesus. And she didn't care. I know I need to find Jesus, and that's what I'm going to do. That's what she did. I know that I found him. I know where he's at. I'm going to find him. And it's interesting here because, you know what? She could have said, you know what? Jairus is more important than me. He's a synagogue ruler. I'm sure Jesus is going to look at him and go, you know what? Your daughter's more important. You know, we don't have any idea what's going through her mind other than we do know she's unclean. We do know that society was not going to welcome her with open arms knowing this. We know that this is from the law. This is not going to happen. But yet she refused to give up. And I want you to know what she really did is that she decided there's no excuse that's going to stop me from getting to Jesus. None whatsoever. And so as we see this, but I want to talk about this lady's faith though first. She had this faith that I'm going to get there no matter what. But I don't know if you guys noticed or not. There's something about her faith that's a little off. Okay? And what I mean by that is that she does something. Listen to this. Listen to what happens here. It says very simply this. In verse 31, immediately the flow of blood had dried up again once she had touched Jesus. And by the way, it wasn't just the touch that healed her. It was her faith along with touching Jesus that healed her. That's what healed her, okay? She knew she had to get to him. And again, and here we see Jesus in verse 31. The disciples in verse 31 saying, you see the crowds pressing in on you, and you say, who touched me? And it's interesting there, and then he says, and he looked around to see the woman who had done this. So Jesus had to look around the crowd. So in other words, she didn't just touch Jesus and hang out right there. Okay? She didn't just stay right there. Because if she would have just stayed right there, the Bible would have said so. She was trying to figure out a way that maybe she wouldn't get caught by, I think, more so of the people around her, okay? And so her faith was a little bit, not so much her faith, her personality made her a little bit timid, okay? You ever meet people who are timid? Okay, timid people sometimes can depend, I think we all can be timid at times, but I think that when we meet someone who's timid all the time, they drive you crazy, don't they? You know, they want something, and they're so timid, they do zero to go get it, okay? I mean, we've all been there, and I mean, like I said, there's just times it happens. Well, here's this woman. She wasn't going to be timid about what she wanted, but boy, she was just, Jesus had to look for her, it tells us there, isn't it? That's what it said, he had to look for her. So she stepped back just a little bit, but she knew what, though? What mattered is what? That Jesus was going to heal her. That Jesus was going to take care of her. Guys, when we go to Jesus, we need to remember that he will take care of us. Now, let's look at Jairus for just a moment. What was his faith like? I'm going to Jesus, he'll take care of it. Oh, he said, I know who you are, Jesus, but I know what you can do. Listen, he didn't read the books about what Jesus did. There's a good possibility he witnessed many of them. And most certainly, there were many people who had firsthand account of what Jesus did. Accounts, literally, probably more than once, of the things that Jesus Christ did. Okay? So he knew where he needed to go. He knew these things. But Jesus literally looks at her. If you notice there, when he said, who touched me? And it's interesting here because Jesus knew something was different. Have you ever had somebody brush up against you, like maybe, you're going through the store and you guys try to go through the same spot, and you can't really get through there? Do you ever notice that you can usually tell if a person you know is the one you brush up against versus a person you don't? You usually can, okay? And if you're really paying attention, okay? And so here I want us to see here that Jesus wanted to see this woman. If you notice there, it says, and he looked around, verse 32, to see the woman who had done this. But it says the woman was fearing and she was trembling, aware of what had happened to her, and it says here, came and fell down at his feet. Then he says in verse 34, it says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your afflictions. You see, this is what it was here. Here we see Jesus. Here we see this. I want us to remember something now. Now, when this happens, remember the two individuals, Jairus' daughter. Jairus was the one so far at this point that he is the one in the conversation because he's the one that went to Jesus. So we have Jairus, we have the woman. She got healed first, as far as we know. We don't know that Jairus' daughter wasn't healed already at this point, but we do know, actually she wasn't, because we have the message that come that she has died. So what we do know is she got healed first. Now that wasn't her intention. Her intention was she just wanted to get better, okay? And so she had no idea what was going to take place other than that. But I want you to know what happens here. I want you to see this. I want us to see that, she went to him and this came out. But Jesus did something here. Jesus always publicly made sure the people knew that this woman was okay. Did you catch that part? He said to her, you're fine. You have been healed. You have been taken care of. Look what it says, your faith has made you well. Whole, completely, you're perfectly back to what you're supposed to be. Completely back where you're supposed to be. It's perfectly fine. And your afflictions are gone. Your problems are gone. Your struggles are gone. All this is gone because you had that faith. And now we need to see that he publicly did this. He didn't pull her aside and whisper that in her ear, did it? Did he? No. Because they're in a big crowd. Okay, so publicly, Jesus is telling this woman, hey, good things have just happened to you. I want you to listen to what Psalm 102 says. Psalm 107, verse 2, and then Psalm 107, verses 20 and 21 say. Okay, listen to this. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, who he hath redeemed from the hand of the enemy. He sent his word and healed them. Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. So now we see that this crowd saw yet again the power of Jesus. And you notice he didn't speak any words, did he? He spoke no words. At least for her healing, he did not speak any words. But yet he knew that something had gone out of him. He knew that this woman was changed because of what her faith had done. It's interesting. I want you to think about your faith. I want you to think about my faith. Let's think about our faith. How many of us would have enough faith, do you think, to go find Jesus and at all expense go touch him? I guess it might depend how desperate we are, right? It might even depend upon, it really isn't even so much as how far away he was, because in her case, she didn't have any money anymore. She was going to get there. It wasn't like Jesus was going to jump on a boat and cross the Atlantic Ocean, or he was going to get an airplane. He was going to be somewhere in that vicinity. And I believe if she wouldn't have found him there, she would have found him somewhere else. I really do believe that. I think she would have found him because it was so important to her to get healed. So important to her. And as we think about our life, would we do so? And she was going to, I can now tell people what Jesus did for me. You know what's interesting? This is immediate effect. When you read the scriptures, there's very few times when Jesus heals someone that they're not immediately healed. Now, there's a couple of times, okay? All right, but in general, when he says you're healed, they're healed, okay? So he doesn't ever take days to heal someone. He literally, for the words finish coming out of his mouth, or right after his words finish coming out of his mouth. If you remember, Jesus made some mud out and some spit, and he put it on somebody's eyes, and they became healed. There's many different times when you even go back to the Old Testament, okay? And you find that there was many of them. I believe it was Sisera. I'm trying to remember. I'm going to draw a blank on the captain's name of the army. And he said, "Go wash in the river," and went and washed in the river, right? And he got his sight back. He got the leprosy gone. There's all kinds of things that we see here. So now we're going to see another victory. Okay, we saw victory over her ailment. Now we're going to see victory because listen. Jesus had not healed Jairus' daughter yet, right? That hasn't happened yet. It's going to, all right? It's going to, but it hasn't happened yet. So now Jesus showed the people his power over health, his power over disease, and now he's going to show people his power over death, okay? Pick it up in verse 35, all right? We're going to go down to verse 43, to the end of the chapter. It says, while he was standing speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue officials, saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" I want you to pay attention to the words used by the people coming from the synagogue. This was not an ordinary synagogue led by ordinary people. They acknowledged Jesus was the teacher. My Bible capitalizes the word teacher. Okay, so they're acknowledging that Jesus is something special. Okay, so here we see this coming out. But Jesus, overhearing what was spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe." And he allowed no one to accompany him except Peter and James and John, brother of James. They came to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw a commotion and people loudly weeping and wailing. And entering in, he said to them, "Why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep." Verse 40, they began laughing at him. I can tell you one thing, that is probably one of the last things anybody should really want to do is laugh at Jesus, but they did, all right? But they did. All right, and so it says, but putting them out, he took along the child's father and mother and his own companions, and members that would have been those he brought with him for Peter and James and John. And he said, and they entered the room where the child was. Taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha Kuma," which translated, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded. And he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this. And he said that something should be given her to eat. Now, as I was looking at this, it's interesting because there's a lot of cool things there. First of all, Jesus, there in verse 41, there's some Latin spoken there by Jesus because the Romans spoke Latin. Okay, so you also had the Greek language thrown in there. You had the Hebrew language thrown in there. So you have various languages throughout the Middle East still to this day. But now here we see Jesus. Here we see Jairus. Here we see, it's hard to imagine. We don't really know what took place in the mind of Jairus from verse 21 to verse 22. Okay? All we know is that from verse 21 to verse 22, Jairus showed up where Jesus was. Okay? We don't know if he sat and thought about this, contemplated his daughter's sickness for days. We don't know what was going through his mind other than he knew Jesus could heal him. Remember, he had to swallow his pride. He was a leader of a synagogue. He was out there, and that people knew who he was. So he had to go out. He would have known. Remember, this is why I told you it's interesting. Did the synagogue rulers love Jesus for the most part? Did they? No, absolutely not. Okay? It was ultimately some of those rulers that did what to Jesus? Had him crucified, turned him over to the Romans and had him crucified, right? So here we see that Jairus, remember, like I said, didn't care at this point. Did not care at this point as far as we know, didn't care. We don't know the conversation he had with himself. We have no idea what was going through his mind other than my daughter needs healing. That's all he cared about. So this is where we're at, and he went and did so. Now, here we see Jesus. There's a good possibility for Jairus. I mean, we need to think about this. Society today, it's interesting to listen to people who have no idea about things. Like, for instance, I was watching a video the other night. They had two white ladies talking about discrimination against black people. You guys hear what I just said? two white people were experts talking about discrimination against black people. That's silliness. Why? Because a white person can't do that. All we can do is point fingers at each other. We can't do that because we don't experience it, right? And now here we see this. Some of these people here probably undoubtedly knew who Jesus was, had probably seen him. They had probably gotten ticked off at Jesus once or twice by some of the words he did, some of the things he said in the synagogues. And yet here is Jairus going to the guy that some of them couldn't really care less if he was around. But who did not care? Jairus. Didn't care. So he's going to go to this. He was going to go to the one who could give his daughter victory. He was the one that was there. Now let's see some of these words that was spoken to Jesus. Verse 36. Jesus says to Jairus, "You have nothing to be afraid of." Listen, do not be afraid any longer. Stop being afraid right this second, right this instant. You don't need to be afraid anymore. Why not? Who was he talking to? Jesus. Who has power over life and death? Jesus. Right? So he is sitting here talking to Jesus, Jesus is talking to Jairus. Here he says, there's nothing to be scared of any longer. He says this to him, though. He does say this. He does say this, guys. Listen. He says, believe. Don't ever stop believing. Believe. And I'm going to continue to do this. Believe. Believe. I really do believe many times in our personal lives, and especially in the lives of our churches, that, guys, we forget how important it is to believe. Is God going to do it, or is God not going to do something? I don't believe God will ever tell his children no, as long as what we want to do for him brings praise and honor and glory to him. He isn't going to say no. No, don't go tell anybody about me. He's not going to say that to us. He's going to say, absolutely, go. Do so. Do the things that we need to. This is what happened. He says, believe. Simply believe. And his belief caused what? His daughter to live. His belief in Jesus brought life back to his daughter. Because we know from the scripture, she wasn't sleeping. She wasn't in a heavy fog. She was dead. She was dead. And here we see this, that Jesus says, don't worry about it. Stop. Now, in Jesus' time, and I'm sure there's some other times and places around the world that there was professional mourners, okay? And so here we have a group of people. Now, I'm not saying that these are all professional mourners. These people could be sincere in their emotions. They could be sincere in what was taking place. But Jesus nonetheless kicks them out. Did he not? He kicked them out, okay? Because I find this is he comes to the home, and the first thing he does is says, get out. Get out. That's the first thing he does. And if you notice here, that is there. And then what does he do? He only goes into the room. The Bible tells us that he goes into the room. But notice what happens here in verse 39. The child's asleep. Now, what did he tell Jairus? He told Jairus, only believe, right? Only believe. So when Jairus walked in, and when we're getting ready to walk in just a moment here to see his daughter, when Jesus said only believe, Jairus would have been doing what? Believing Jesus. If you say she's asleep, we don't have this conversation that's obviously taking place in his head. We have no idea. But I can tell you what is probably there by looking through the scriptures. He's probably thinking, yep, Jesus is going to take care of this. He's got this. Not a problem. All right? And I'm sure he's very emotional. I'm sure he's got, he might even have tears in his eyes. I don't know. But all I do know is his daughter's dead. But he knows deep down, Jesus said, all you've got to do is believe and everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. And all of a sudden, here we see this. Like I said, I just personally don't believe it's a great idea to laugh at Jesus. Okay? But nonetheless, that's exactly what these mourners did. But do you know why they laughed at Jesus? They didn't believe in him. They didn't believe in him. And they thought he was stupid. Not ignorant, stupid. And why can I make that statement? Because they knew he was dead. That makes sense, that the girl was dead. They knew she was dead. How dare this stupid guy walk in and tell us she's asleep? Okay, they knew she was dead, and they thought, well, Jesus, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's out of his mind. She's dead. And it's interesting here because these are the mourners. He says, get out. Get out. The girl is still alive. She is not dead, but she sleeps. Paul wrote and told us very simply that there is going to be, as Christians, we have life over death. Did you know that? We do. Because of Jesus Christ. Here in this case, this is going to be literally physical life. But nonetheless, this is exactly what it is. Now remember, I want to spend just a little bit more time with that phrase and looking at this whole encounter taking place with those who didn't believe. Okay? Because then literally in verse 41, the Bible tells us that Jesus took his hand, he reached down, and he put his hand upon this young child, upon this 12-year-old child. And he says very simply to them, Talitha cum. And she got up, and she was alive. He simply said to her, get up. I say to you, get up. And what happened? She got up. She got up. Why? Because Jesus Christ has power over death. Get up. And I need to rephrase something. He was not speaking in Latin. He was speaking Aramaic in that case. I apologize for that. It was Aramaic. So here he is speaking Aramaic. Here he is speaking to her. She got up. But it's very interesting here that we see this. Now, we know from the encounters in the previous verses, we know that the girl was dead. We know it couldn't have been for that long, right? We know it couldn't have been for that long. But we do know that she has died. We do know that, that this situation took place to bring praise, honor, glory, hopefully people to Jesus Christ. This we do know that happens because remember, Jesus never did anything by accident. He did things so that people could ultimately see his Father. So now he's also showing the world his love. He's showing the world his power. Think about this for a moment. How many people, apart from doctors, are willing to go help anybody who's dead and they can bring them back to life? Right? I mean, if you think about all the people on the face of this earth, right here, right now, right this second, having heart attacks. And there's a lot. And who helps them? The doctors. All right? Very few people can do some of those things. And yet, here is Jesus. He says, you know what? You're fine. She came back to life. She was healed from her sickness. She got out of bed. And she began, and it says there in verse 42, that she got up and started walking. She got up, and says, immediately began to walk. Immediately, she got out. And now again, those mourners, those unbelievers, it's possible that there could have been, who knows, all kinds of thoughts going through their mind. But yet here we see Jesus showing his love, showing his power. Now, what's interesting here is that we don't really know much more after this event how this family was affected by the circumstances that just took place. We don't have any idea. We don't know if the young girl, we don't know if Jairus, we don't know if his wife, we don't know if they had any other kids or any other family member. We don't know if any of those people ever came around to recognize and accept Jesus Christ in their life as their Lord and Savior. There's always going to be some that they came to Jesus and all they wanted was to use him. Now, I think Jairus was sincere. I think Jairus wanted his daughter healed. I don't think there was no ounce of insincerity here. But we don't have any indication if he continued to follow Jesus. As far as we know, after this is over, he went back to the synagogue. That's all we can assume. We don't have any idea. Okay? So, and why can we assume that? Because that's what he was doing prior to this event. All right? So here we see this happening. Here, this is what it's all about. But I want you to know something. Even though we don't know about this young girl, we don't know if she ever accepted Jesus Christ into her life after this. I'm sure they're all very, very grateful. But what she did for the rest of her life was this. every time somebody saw her who knew what took place, they're going to say, that's the little girl that Jesus raised. That's the little girl that Jesus took care of. See, God's power is strong. God's power is great. And we need to remember this. And here we see in these chapters here in Mark, here we see the power of Jesus Christ. We know that Jesus Christ overcame dangers. We know that Jesus Christ overcame death and disease and all these things here. And yet these are exactly what people needed to see. Eventually, it was getting to the point for Jesus where he finally had to say, I'm no longer doing miracles. You're either going to have to believe who God is without them, or you're not going to believe at all. Because people would only come to Jesus because they wanted healed. And he finally said, that's not why I'm here. That's not why I'm here. Because that's not why the church is here either. We're not here just for simply people to say, boy, that's a nice church. Right? That's not, and I don't care what the denomination is, where it's located. That's not why the church is here. Our job as a church is to make sure people see God through us, especially when they walk through the door of the church. And Jesus eventually said, I can't do that anymore. I want people to know my Father. I want people to be rescued and be set free from this. Now, Jesus still watches over people, doesn't he? He does. He didn't stop doing those things. He watches over you. You can, if you like, you can go to Acts chapter 12, and you can see where God rescues people from danger. You know, you can go to 2 Corinthians, and you see Paul ultimately writing through and talking about people have affliction in their life. You can go to Romans in chapter 8, and you can see where Paul reminds us that we're more than conquerors because of Jesus Christ. You know, this is things that we need to remember. These are things that I hope we all need to remember. I always find it interesting. I don't know about you, but when I read my Bible, there's times when Jesus speaks and he says one of two things after he does the miracles. And anybody know what they are? One, don't tell anybody, or two, tell people. That's it. Sometimes he tells them, don't tell anybody, and guess what happened? That's what happened right here. He said, but don't tell anybody that this just took place. I mean, everybody would have figured it out, right? But I want you to know there's times that Jesus could not do ministry because people wouldn't listen. Because they went out and they literally went out and told everybody what Jesus did. Well, they were excited. I can't really blame them. But when Jesus says don't, what should we do? Don't. Right? When Jesus says we should, then we should. So as we think about this chapter, we need to remember we have a God who sent his son Jesus for us, who does and will continue to do awesome things for his children. But remember, he told Jairus, there's two key phrases, and I will close. I'll have Brother Donnie come. There's two things. Number one, we see in verse 22 that Jairus believed Jesus could do it because he fell at his feet. He fell at his feet. And then we know a little bit further down, Jesus said, believe. Believe. Don't ever stop believing in who Jesus Christ is. We've got to remember that. There are so many people out there, guys, they don't want to trust who Jesus is because they don't know who he is. And our job as Christians for many people is simply to let them know who he is. You know, sometimes we get so disappointed. Man, I shared Jesus with them. Why did they accept him? Why did they become a Christian? Because they weren't ready. But what matters is, are you faithful? Are we faithful in making sure that we do that? Making sure when we have our times with people that they have that opportunity to know who Jesus is. And as I look around tonight, I think we all can say that we know Jesus. Or if we don't, we're fooling each other. But the reality is that without Jesus, we don't have anything. You hear people say that all the time. I don't know what that means. That literally means we have nothing. We have no hope. We have no peace. We have no grace. We have no mercy. We have none of those things in our life because Christ gives those to us. So I hope tonight you can say, you know what? As Jairus did, I'm going to believe. Brother Donnie, would you come? Do you believe tonight? Do you believe in Jesus? No, Jairus went to Jesus and he didn't care what anybody thought about it. The woman with the issue of blood, she came to Jesus. She didn't care. She needed that help. Will you come to him? Father God, we thank you for the fact that we're able to read what Jesus did in the life of Jairus and his daughter, and really, Lord, others who saw it. And for the woman, Lord, who he healed. Lord God, I ask that we'll just simply remember, Lord, simply remember how much you love us. And that, Lord, we'll come to you, Lord, and you will answer us. You'll take care of us, Lord. I ask, Father God, we'll just believe you, and we'll believe. And I ask in your name, amen. Thank you for coming tonight. I sure hope we'll see you back here on Tuesday night for Bible, for Wednesday as well, because remember, we'll have a business meeting prior to Bible study.